Well, thank you, Ginger, and we're going to get started. My name is Angie Snyder, and I'm the Executive Director for Opus Peace. So first, thank you to everyone for joining us today and being a part of our live chat. Our conversation today is going to be around the topic of forgiveness. I know personally, this is a topic that can be very difficult to engage in and even harder to implement the process of forgiveness. So we're very fortunate today to have several members with us who are part of the Dare to Forgive film, which is going to be released soon. And also it is my pleasure to welcome our moderator for today, Kathy Metcalf. Kathy is the volunteer manager for Adare Health and Hospice. So thank you so much, Kathy, for being with us today. And I'm going to hand it over to you to get us started. Yep, come off mute, Kathy.
Rookie mistake. Let's go. Thank you so much, Angie, for having me on today. I'm excited to be hosting this chat about forgiveness. I know for me, it has not always been easy, but Opus Peace has given me some tools and concepts that I can apply in my own life. I'm also honored to be here today to introduce our three panelists. You may not be aware, but Opus Peace is getting ready to release a forgiveness film. And these three panelists who are with us today are featured on that film. So let's start introducing the team. The first is Rolf Osman. He's a veteran of U.S. Navy aviation. He is also retired from the Smoky Mountain Home Health and Hospice, where he served as director of volunteers. He is an Opus Peace educator who has spoken across the country about soul injury. Welcome, Ralph.
Hello, Kathy.
Next, we have Deb Grassman. She is the founder of Opus Peace, a nonprofit organization based in St. Petersburg, Florida. She has written 2 books, Peace at Last and The Hero Within. She is a contributing editor to 4 textbooks, has published 25 articles, and there are 5 documentary films featuring her work on soul injury. Welcome, Deborah.
Thank you, Kathy. Very glad to be here today.
Last and not least, I want to introduce you to Stephanie Turner. She is a patient care manager with Kansas City Hospice and Palliative Care. Stephanie is also an Opus Peace educator who has been sharing the message of soul injury in her community with a special focus on suicide survivors. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you. It's a privilege and honor to be here today with everyone and to have walked through and continue to walk through my forgiveness journey with Deborah Grassman and Opus Peace. So thank you for inviting me here.
Thank you. So we're going to get going with our chat today by starting out with some feature film clips from the forgiveness film. And we're going to chat with our panelists and ask them a few questions in between those clips. Our first section will be from Stephanie. Listen as she explains the definition and some basics about forgiveness.
We've all heard this expression, we can't change the past. However, we can change our relationship to the past. And the means that which we do this, it's called forgiveness. And learning the process of forgiveness will help us come home to ourselves. If you work in hospice the way that I do, then you already appreciate that at the end of life, for all of us, the past looms large and forgiveness issues need attention. What does forgiveness allow? It allows us to lay down our burden, release anger and resentment and a desire to retaliate. It is freedom from self-imposed bondage. It does not make a wrong right, and it does not mean that we have to forget. But what it does mean to authentically forgive is that you must touch that part of yourself that hurts. And that's what makes it difficult, and that is why people avoid doing it. But what I discovered was that I could consciously survive the hurt once I stopped fearing to feel the pain. And I also learned how to let my soul, my deepest part of self, carry my pain because my soul, the soul, is not afraid of pain. Some people say that holding on to resentment is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Ouch. In fact, if you look up the definition in Webster's dictionary, it says to give up resentment against or a desire to retaliate. Well, isn't that true? When someone hurts us, don't we want to hurt them back? Or at the least, we want them to hurt as much as we hurt. But what ends up happening? We end up drinking that poison, and we end up becoming less of who we are.
Kathy, come off mute.
Stephanie, I know for many people that forgiveness can be something we fear, and even we sometimes want to run away from it. What feelings rise up in you when you in particular think about forgiveness?
So I think that it depends on the level of forgiveness for me. And so initially in my journey, when I started working through forgiveness issues, I was very scared. I was very angry, and I was very resentful, and it was hard. So I either wanted to stuff them and move on, or just be bitter and angry in it. Now that I've moved to a different level of forgiveness, what I see is that there are different categories of forgiveness for me. For example, today, when I was driving into work and I was delayed because of traffic, I needed to make a conscious decision whether I was going to let that ruin my day or not, and forgive the traffic for, being delayed, for being backed up, for taking extra time this morning, which was important to do in that moment. But when it comes to maybe, an issue like my spouse, and maybe he lied about something, that is definitely a different level of forgiveness. And when I think about my feelings regarding that, that's a little deeper, a little harder, and takes more courage to move into. So I have to decide, am I going to work through that forgiveness now, or am I going to work through it later? So I think that there are different levels of forgiveness when you're in the process of it, and maybe daily when you're working through it.
Mhm. Also addressed in that clip is you can't change the past, but you can change the relationship to the past. This is a question for all of our panelists now. How does that relationship with the past and changing in it and addressing it free you from it?
Well, to me, when I think of that question, how do you change your relationship to the past? The key word is change. There's a saying that goes, if nothing changes, nothing changes. And the only thing that any of us have any control over is ourselves. So the only thing that we can do to change anything about our past is the way we think and feel about the past. So it all starts with a conversation with ourselves, being curious about why we think and feel about what it was that happened back in the past. And when we get curious, we start asking ourselves questions like, is there another point of view? Or do I feel guilty? Or do I feel helpless? And so that's where it all starts, is by being curious with yourself, realizing that you're the only one that has any control over that, and being able to, as Stephanie says, step into it.
Thank you, Rolf. I'm wondering, Deborah, how does Opus Peace define forgiveness? Could you share with us a little bit about that?
Well, Oprah had a guest on her show one time. He had been in a concentration camp, and to me, he offered the best definition, and it's one that we have adopted for use as well, and that is giving up the hope that the past can be any different than what it was. Now, I got to tell you, when I first heard that, I was like, I kind of argued with it, in my mind. I'm like, giving up the hope? You never want to give up hope. Oh my gosh. I mean, I had done my master's thesis on hope and its relationship to ceremonies. So, I mean, I was really invested in hope. What do you mean giving up hope? But when you really think about that definition and what it is, it allows us to let go in a certain way of all those it should have, it could have, if only, all those kinds of things from the past. It also allows us to become more real. It's not unusual for all of us to use denial. Denial, don't even notice I am lying to myself. It's not unusual to look back on the past and kind of paint it a prettier picture than what it actually was, as a way to then not have to do the forgiveness work. So to answer your question, I'll repeat that again because I think it is a profound statement. And I also think it takes a little bit, at least for me, to sink in, which is giving up the hope that the past can be any different than what it was. And in so many ways, that's the secret for becoming real. It also allows us to really move into the present moment. When Stephanie was just talking about having to forgive the traffic for delaying her getting to work and being frustrated and those types of things, it's giving up the hope that there's no traffic today. So we don't think in those terms, but when you can think in those kinds of terms, then you can re-enter the present moment. Otherwise, you're sitting there thinking, oh, this moment should not be the way it is. Oh, this moment could be different, or whatever it might be. But when we can give up that hope that it's any different than what it is, then we can truly live in the now. And that's truly, I think, forgiveness is the secret for living in the present moment. Living in the present moment isn't about blocking out the past or not thinking about the future. It's truly being able to be in the now and open up to all that it is and all that it is not. So at any rate, thank you for that question.
Yeah, it's
Thank
a
you,
great
Deborah.
question. And I would like to add to that is that you were saying, how does it change the relationship to the past? When you do all of those things that Deborah was suggesting, you release what pain does in your body, mentally and physically and emotionally, because holding on to pain, even though we think if we stifle it, we don't, go there anymore, it really begins to change the body dynamics. It can create things like stomach issues, head issues, anxiety issues. It can create emotional and mental not well-being. We can be just in a place that we aren't able to live lives with peace and contentment, enjoyment, because we have a different relationship to the past versus working through that with forgiveness. So I think the answer to that question, it doesn't potentially free you, it does free you.
Thank you for adding to it, Stephanie, and thank you, Deborah. Those are great.
I was just to add to what Stephanie just said, because she also mentioned about forgiveness being a process and that it takes time. I do think there is a rhythm to it. And I think there also, sometimes we think we've done 90% of the forgiveness work and that should be enough. And I think it should be enough myself, but the true liberation comes with that last 10% that stays clutching at our heart. And it's when you can really dig at the thing that's the closest to you, the betrayal that's the closest to you, whatever it might be, that's the true liberation. It doesn't, and forgiveness doesn't just happen like that. It's not just a one-time, oh, I let it go. And let it go is often just a code word for, I'm not going to think about it. That's not forgiveness.
No, and I would say from your work, I've learned that it is indeed a process. We're going to keep moving on, and now we're going to watch a favorite clip of mine. It's It's one from Deborah Grassman. And I haven't known Deborah very long, but I will say she's the least hostile person I've ever met. And we are actually going to see a glimpse of her hostility. So it's in contrast to whom I have met, but it shows how real she is and how real we can have these experiences, and how we can frame them maybe in a different way. So let's take a minute here and listen to Deb's clip.
Now, lest you think I'm not hostile, I travel a lot on airplanes almost every week, and I'm sitting in the window seat, and a man and his wife come down and sit down next to me. And you know, the first thing you have to do is kind of jockey for elbow room on that armrest. And so this man plops his elbow down on the armrest, and I'm not kidding you, it came more than halfway into my seat. So I'm sitting there, and I looked over at him, and I said, "Excuse me, sir." And he looked back at me, and he smiled. Didn't move his elbow one bit. So I'm sitting there, looking down at this elbow, and I said, tapping on it, "Excuse me, sir." And he looks back at me, and he smiles. Well, let me tell you what I did. Now it was no longer about comfort and armrests. It had turned into a power struggle. And for the next 10 minutes, I plotted ways to get back at him. I saw him look up from his reading to look out my window, and I strongly considered pulling the shade down. His wife sat on the other side of him, and their conversation indicated that they had a lot of money. I considered ways I could use this information. I could chide him for his sense of entitlement when he sits in the coach section with us poor folks, or I could ridicule him for not being rich enough to sit in first class where he would have all the elbow room he needed. But then I felt a sneeze coming on. This too could prove useful. I could refrain from covering my mouth. Just the previous week, there had been a story on the news about an airline passenger with TB. Maybe I could tell Mr. Elbow that I had TB. I settled on sneezing with my mouth open. But the satisfaction I began to feel from my revenge suddenly melted as I realized what I was doing. I laughed at the hypocrite that I was. Here I was running around the country talking about the effects of our personal wars on national wars, and I'm sitting here plotting World War III against an elbow.
You would choose that one, Kathy.
It just cracked me up, because going through Leadership Institute with you, that is not who I know you to be in the day-to-day. So what I really am curious about in that clip, Deb, is how hard is it for a person to become curious about their hostility, especially in the moment?
Well, first of all, we're all hostile. People like me, and maybe many people who are joining us today who are nurses, caregivers, peacemakers, those types that we want to be, and most of the time are, tend to stuff into what we call the shadow side of ourselves, anger and hostility, and we deny that or put it away, compartmentalize it, what have you. So it's very easy for us, if our self-image doesn't allow ourselves to recognize that all of us have hostility. All of us get angry, and in that situation should get angry when a boundary has been crossed. I mean, this man clearly had, this is not a hard call to make when his elbow's sitting here right in front of me. So, I mean, when boundaries are crossed, you should get angry. The big thing is, and Ralph used the word earlier, was just getting curious, you know, being able to be curious. And what changed my attitude, again, and that's what I wrote about, was when I was able to kind of laugh at myself. And, you know, if we take ourselves so seriously, and that's when we become ashamed of ourselves and stuff down. but if we can kind of take our antics that we do kind of lightheartedly and kind of laugh at ourselves, then the ego releases its clutch on us. And then we don't have to keep things stuffed into the shadows. So I think when I was able to kind of laugh at myself and see how ridiculous I was being, I mean, I actually sneezed with my mouth open. I mean, but I mean, I literally laughed out loud after I did that. I mean, that kind of woke me up. And, you know, I was able to say hello to my hostile self. And that's not a part of me that I enjoy seeing. But then again, you know, in a bit of a way, you have to think in terms of self-forgiveness. We haven't talked about yet either. But when we do commit those types of hostile acts, to be able to not only ask for forgiveness, but also to have the insight to learn from it and not do it again. I haven't sneezed openly on anybody else since then.
Good job. So this is actually kind of taking what Deb talked about and bringing it to all the panelists. She said we are all hostile, and I would recognize we all have that shadow side to ourselves. So hearing from the other folks on the team here, what do you do when you catch yourself slipping into that shadow self or that hostility, to be in the moment and catch yourself to prevent something from turning into World War III?
So I think a part of what Deborah has talked about hostility, well, it definitely resonated with me, because I think it's important that we have the courage to recognize when we're hostile, because hostility doesn't mean that we have to have angry outbursts with everyone. So that's why I love this story. I laugh every time I hear it, because it is a way that we are hostile. And if we were to like, oh, I'm not hostile, I'm just going to ignore him the rest of the time, or Mr. Elbow, that's not okay either. And so either one of those is to an extreme. But if we had the courage just to go, oh, I'm feeling hostile, what is the best way to handle this to protect my boundaries, and yet be able to be at a place to maybe connect with Mr. Elbow? Because Mr. Elbow is not going to entertain anything else but taking up your space and being overly in charge or whatever. But if I recognize that I'm feeling hostile, then I may actually be able to incorporate some of my skills of connecting with Mr. Elbow. And once connecting with him, he may, not always, but at some point begin to recognize what he was doing. And it is only with these kinds of connections that we can try to offer more peace in this world. So I think not only it may be courageous to recognize our hostility, but it also can help us with our tools to be able to navigate this world in giving more connection and peace.
Thank you, Stephanie. We are going to...
I was just going to say, just real quickly too, is that hostility, if you uncover it and really look, it's covering up hurt of some kind in some ways. So, you know, when we're hostile, it's a great way to keep the hurt away so that I don't have to feel my hurt. I can just blame you for causing me to get angry. So I think anytime there's hostility or anger that's out of proportion to the boundary that's been crossed, it is a matter of looking for the hurt. And we have a lot of violence in this world right now. And I always say, if we would start asking people, you know, who are violent to say, tell me how you're hurting right now, we might get to the source of the violence.
Thank you for that. That's a true point.
Mm-hmm.
We are going to move on to another topic. There's so many wonderful topics in this forgiveness film, and we're getting a lot of questions, but I want to keep things going so we kind of touch on everything and give people an overview so they know what's in this wonderful film. So we're going to keep going, and the next clip is actually going to be Rolf. And Rolf is going to talk to us about collective wounding that occurs with the marginalized populations. I know I never really thought a lot about collective wounding and how often it occurs in our society. And Rolf's information in the movie really helped me frame that differently in my own life.
Time in this section by thinking about collective wounding. Wounding that often occurs with marginalized populations who are discriminated against. This requires collective forgiveness. Most of you are probably familiar with Desmond Tutu. He led the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. Desmond Tutu had every reason to hate and be bitter, but he didn't. Instead, he worked to forgive the oppressors. He even wrote a book entitled The Book of Forgiving. Let's look at what he says about collective forgiveness. We are not served by forgetting our history. That we're not just supposed to shut up and silence our voice or try to pretend that anything that happened is anything other than what it was. If we do that, it means we are carrying a cross of lies. Forgiveness does not mean that we pretend that things are any different than what they are. If we minimize our pain or try to numb it away, it means we stay stuck in our denial and illusions rather than cultivating the courage to be with the truth. Desmond Tutu says that when we are willing to stand in our truth, we can get real with who we are. When we cultivate honesty, courage, and humility, we have the strength to say, I am angry this was done to me. I am sad and I am lost. I will do everything in my power to not let you harm me again. I will not retaliate against you or against myself. Maybe you are familiar with the genocides that took place in Rwanda, the slaughter of thousands and thousands of people. One young woman worked hard to recover and forgive the man who had murdered her entire family. She gave voice to what she thought her family would want to say to the murderers. If you would have known me, and if you would have known yourself, you would not have killed me.
That's such a powerful clip that we shared, Rolf, and your insights are so appreciated. Do you have any other groups that come to mind, Rolf, that could benefit from this concept of collective forgiveness?
I do, Kathy, and I'd like to choose one that's dear to my heart because I am one, and I have many friends who are, and that is the Vietnam veterans. And to do that, I want to try to paint a picture for our participants. If you can, for a while, just imagine you're in a foreign country where it's either kill or be killed. And you know, taking another human life really is not what we're designed to do. And the vast majority of the soldiers in the Vietnam War were just 18 years of age. It also was the first war where there wasn't any front lines, which meant there wasn't an area like 2 or 3 miles back where they could retreat and relax and be safe. In fact, I had a classmate 1 week before he was to come home, he just went for a walk on the outskirts of the camp and stepped on a landmine and lost his life. So the stress was always constant. But there's something that happened to them that was much worse than that. They came home. That's when the civilians got a hold of them. You know, military protocol is that when a soldier is discharged, and I say soldiers here, I mean all branches of the service. When they're discharged and they fly back home, they wear their uniforms. Well, Vietnam veterans were told when they hit the runway, you know, they were told ahead of time to bring an extra change of clothes, have it handy. And as soon as they got in the airport, they went straight and changed out of their uniform and put their civilian clothes on. They were spat on. They were called baby killers among a lot of other names. Even when they went back home, their friends scorned them, they ridiculed them. They suffered a lot of indignities. So can you imagine how that made them feel? And as bad as all that happened in the war, one soldier said this: as bad as it was in the war, the worst part was when I came home. So that's a group of people right there that have collective wounding.
So taking that concept from the film and what you just shared with us, Ralph, can you give us an example then of what collective forgiveness would look like for maybe that group you spoke about, the veterans you spoke about?
Yes. And as I get to explain that, many of you I know are familiar with Opus Peace and Deborah Grassman, but maybe there are people on the call that aren't. And I want you to know that it goes deeper than Deborah. There's Pat McGuire, Marie Bainbridge, Sheila Fitzpatrick, and Shaku Desai, and the 10,000 dying veterans that they cared for over a 30-year span. These nurses all retired about the same time, and that's where Opus Peace came from. They formed Opus Peace. So what we're talking about today and the lessons of forgiveness has as its roots the lessons that they learned. They just didn't feed them pills and push them back in the corner. They talked to them. They learned from them. They loved them. They cared for them. And that's where these lessons that we're talking about today came from. But to get back to the forgiveness, Deborah Grassman was invited to speak at a welcome home ceremony up in Green Bay at Lambeau Field. And there she is, she's sitting on stage. She tells the story much better than I do, and I love hearing the story and the way she tells it. But she's sitting on stage with a bunch of military dignitaries, and they're all dressed up in their finest with their medals on their chest. And out there in the audience is a large crowd of Vietnam veterans out there. And she can feel this wall between her and those veterans, because they're looking at her and say, who's this little woman that's sitting up there? And what does she think she has to say to us? Excuse me if I get a little emotional. I get emotional whenever I think about this. When Deborah stood up to speak that day, she did something that had never been done before. And she said something that had never been done before. She stood in front of those veterans and she apologized to them. She apologized for her actions, her prejudices against Vietnam veterans. She apologized for all civilians who treated those veterans with scorn and indignities and called them baby killers and called them names. She apologized for that. And then she asked for forgiveness. She asked all those burly Vietnam veterans sitting out there for forgiveness. And it was then that she felt that wall of mistrust come down that was between her and the audience. And she was able to then go on and give her speech. So that is, I mean, the best example of collective forgiveness that you could ask for, to stand up in front of however large that audience was. Now to remember what she says, how many people were there that day. But to state, and that is part of the work of forgiveness, is stating the atrocities. You can't just say, please forgive me, or I forgive you, and it's all over with. There's a work to forgiveness. We've talked about that process. I'm mentioning the word work because there is work. It takes hard work sometimes. And that day, that was hard. And Deborah stood up. She used courage and she used bravery, and she apologized. And she just didn't blame it on civilians. She took the blame on herself and her attitude and her actions too. She personalized it to herself. And I really thank her for that.
Thank you for that beautiful story, Ralph. That was a great illustration that we can all relate to. We are going to move on to the next topic in forgiveness. And we're going to hear about how we determine our responsibility for a situation that might require forgiveness. We're going to hear from Ralph again, and he's going to share a story about something that occurred in her own life and assigning responsibility for a situation.
Time in this section by thinking about collective wounding. Now let me tell you about some research that has been done with combat veterans who had unrealistic guilt about things they did or did not do. The researchers required that rather than each of them accepting 100% of the responsibility, that they assign partial responsibility to everyone who contributed to the war. So they asked them, how much responsibility would you say that the U.S. government had for declaring war and sending in the troops? How much responsibility would you assign to the enemy government? And what about the lawmakers and the politicians and the general who developed the plan of attack and the squad leader that was leading your unit, and even civilians with their attitude of, hey, the war's over, get over it? Once these percentages of responsibility were added together and then subtracted from 100, the resultant percentage became the realistic guilt the veterans could assume. The researchers found that when the veterans' guilt became realistic, it became manageable. This research study had a big impact on you with some guilt you were carrying, didn't it, Deborah?
It did, Ralph. Several years ago, my younger sister was diagnosed with a terminal cancer that I knew would take her life in just a few months. She was young, she had young children, and this was tragic for our whole family. She lived in Indiana, I lived in Florida. I would fly up to Indiana for 2 weeks, help to take care of her, go back home to Florida for a week, and this went on for 6 months like that. One day, I was getting ready to go to the airport to leave for Florida. I had my suitcase in one hand, my other hand on the doorknob, and she said, "Don't go." Thought about it for a moment. Then I gave her reassurance that I'd be back the next week. I had other people coming in to help in the interim. And I went on to the airport. Well, after I got home, 3 days later, I received a phone call saying that she had lost consciousness. I flew back up immediately, was at her side for the next 3 days as she was dying, and was at her side when she died. Now, by anyone's standards, including my own, I would have received an A+ for my devotion to her. But it was that one mistake. That one time I did not listen to her. That one time I could have said yes, that I held on to. And it lurked in the background. And I realized it was lurking there several years later when I heard about this research study that Ralph spoke about. And I decided to rethink the position that I had taken with myself. So I sorted it out. It is true that I did have control over saying yes or no. But it was not realistic for me to know that she would become unconscious in 3 days. So I became more realistic. Instead of feeling 110% responsible, I decided that I was 20% responsible for that decision that I made. And that 20% was more realistic for me to be able to forgive. I also recognized that my reality included how I also had responsibilities to tend with my own family and my own workplace. And in that moment, I allowed myself to feel my helplessness of not knowing what I did not know and could not know. In that moment, I released the irrational guilt I was using to numb that ugly feeling of helplessness because I could not change what was happening to her.
It's a powerful clip. Deb, in assigning responsibility, did you use this when you were nursing and working with your patients? And was it effective? Was it a tool that they could use in their own lives for their own applications?
Well, I think the real take-home point was that irrational guilt, being able to sort out how irrational guilt often covers up helplessness. So the real tool that I used in my practice with hospice veterans was when I would hear these stories of irrational guilt. Why did his Jeep blow up? It should have been me. I was walking point. It should have been me. Those types of things. When I would hear irrational guilt, I would immediately, or very soon after I heard that type of story, use that word helpless. I might say, I cannot imagine how helpless you must have felt when that happened. And so that would usually, almost always, open up a whole arena of them realizing that they were not guilty. They had no control. So, when we talk about forgiveness, on the film, Stephanie covers it very thoroughly. The first thing you have to do is, what did you have control over and what did you not have control over? If you feel guilty over something you had no control over, that's irrational. And the intervention is not to forgive. There's nothing to forgive if you had no control. In my sister's situation, I could not have predicted the future. So in that case, I always think in terms of, it's helplessness. They're using the irrational guilt to try to control the helplessness that they were actually feeling, and they're now trying not to feel. So I think, for me, that's what that research study did. I heard it on NPR News, and it didn't really click into me until I was up on stage one time presenting about veterans. And here I am presenting, and all of a sudden it hit me. I just felt my hand on that doorknob that day, that I didn't, that when she said, would you stay? And essentially I said no. And the other reason, some people will say, well, you're being too hard on yourself. But my sister was very aware that she didn't want to be a burden on me. She didn't ask for things unnecessarily or anything like that. And I knew that, and yet I still said no. So I do kind of, that's kind of the 20%, you knew your sister, you knew she never asked anything if she could keep from it. So it's that little piece that, because I knew that, that's why I accepted 20%, because I did know that piece. If that piece wasn't there, I maybe could say, I really had no control, but I did have a little bit, because I knew her well, and I knew she wouldn't have asked unless she really needed me.
Thank you, Deborah. We have one clip left, and then we're going to have someone look in the chat, and there's been a number of questions submitted today about the information we've covered, and we want to get to those. But we have one more clip, and that is actually from part 2 of the forgiveness film. So the information we've been covering thus far has been from the first forgiveness film, part 1. And I'm really excited to say that there's actually going to be a part 2 to this film coming out also. Part 1 really covers concepts, and it's important to know the concepts around forgiveness. But part 2 is really important, and the second part of what you really should have and you don't want to miss. And this part of the forgiveness film series will show, the part 2 will show 9 clips of how those concepts that we've learned today were actually put into practice by people. and how they took the tools and concepts and really used them. It includes someone describing real life situations and how they use this forgiveness methodology to liberate themselves. You're not going to hear only the tools that they used, but also you're going to hear a tabletop discussion with 4 Opus Peace ambassadors during that second part forgiveness film. So we chose to show you just one clip today to let you see a preview of what's coming.
Now let me tell you about
Young children want to please their parents. Add to that the reality that a child's brain development is not yet able to provide insight. So when something bad happens, a child often thinks that they are the cause, and then they feel guilty, a guilt that is unrealistic. We are going to hear from a woman who was molested between the ages of 10 by a close family member. Listen for the ways that she covered up the helpless feelings by becoming overly controlling.
I felt very helpless at that time when that happened as a little girl. I didn't know what I should do. If that I didn't feel comfortable. I knew something is weird, but I didn't know what it was. And sometimes the door was closed. I couldn't escape. And sometimes the door was open and I could escape. But I didn't. Because I wasn't sure if I should escape, because I didn't want to make something wrong. I actually loved that person because it was somebody very close to me. Then I was very overprotecting my kids. I was very anxious when they did something. I was always scared that something happens to them. And my husband used to say, we live in a museum because I wanted to have everything neat in the house to make sure that I have control over what's going on in my house. Because when I was a child, my mother didn't realize what's going on in her house. I was very controlling, especially when they were in my age of, when it happened, 6 to 10 years old. Sometimes even was almost furious when they didn't clean the way I wanted it. And that made hurt them a lot. Because how can they understand that their mother gets mad like this just because they haven't cleaned up the proper way? And I went up to my children and I told them the story and I apologized. And I knew I had to apologize for the right. And it really gave me so much. I felt so released when I did it.
So I feel very overwhelmed at the pain that little Sandra endured and the helplessness that she had. And really, there's not a lot of words that I can put to it, but I can just feel the helplessness as a little girl trying to please, but yet struggling with all that pain.
I think it's interesting as we learn more about abuse that occurs with young children, children that the abuse occurs at a young age, that how often the way that they cope is they internalize the behavior of others. And so they start taking on that somehow their own actions caused this other person to treat them the way that they did. And I like the term irrational guilt when that happens, because certainly there was nothing that that young child could have done differently that would have caused or affected that person's choice to abuse them in the way that they did. That was completely on them. So I think it's really helpful for those of us who've experienced things like this to take the first step to healing, which is recognizing underneath that guilt is that feeling of helplessness, that we were unable to do anything differently, and that we should not own or take on the responsibility of those who chose to behave that way. But sometimes accepting that you are helpless can be challenging in and of itself. To acknowledge and feel vulnerable, to acknowledge that you are helpless in a situation, even if you were a child. It's hard to acknowledge that we don't have control over ourselves or our environment.
That I tried to put myself in her shoes, and it made me realize that she had suffered a loss. She not only suffered trauma, but she suffered a loss because she trusted somebody in her family, and they weren't who she thought she was. So she lost that person. It wasn't a death, but she lost that person that she loved and trusted. And so she suffered that loss. And then a close family member, to me, speaks to the fact that she was maybe constantly or quite often around that person. And so it was like the trauma was reinforced, and that she had to live with that feeling. It was like rubbing salt in a wound.
And that carried over into her adult self, and then turned into behaviors where she turned her home into a museum. And I'm so struck by the way that she was so courageous in gathering her children together and telling them in detail what happened to her, and then apologizing for the way that she became overly controlling and how she managed their household.
I remember sitting with Sandra when she started to understand how to sit with the feelings of helplessness at our Soul Injury Leadership Institute. And that's when she started to understand being able to feel helpless and then open up to the ability to forgive herself because she truly was helpless in that situation.
That's such a powerful clip. I want to be sure we get to the questions that all of you have posted during this powerful meeting we've had. So I'm just going to ask Deborah one last question, and then we're going to get on to the viewer inquiries. Deborah, what do you need to do to overcome unrealistic guilt and overly controlling behaviors and do the work of forgiveness?
Well, if there's overly controlling behaviors and unrealistic guilt, the answer to your question is really very simple and yet not easy. And it is to help people feel their helplessness. That's what they're resisting. That's what they're trying to cover up. And, you know, oftentimes we are running away from the very thing that will free us up. And again, all the research in, you know, somatic therapies, you know, Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score, he would be the first one to say helplessness, unfelt helplessness, ends up getting stored in the body. So believe it or not, what they're trying to avoid, helping people who are overly controlling, helping people who have irrational guilt to actually be able to name helplessness, number one, recognize it. And then the hard part is moving it from the head, that 12-inch journey down to the heart, to be able to actually feel it. And then they can they may not need those overly controlling behaviors so much. And that was certainly the case for Sandra. And if she were here with us today, she would be the first to tell you how a lot of her overly controlling behaviors and keeping her house just perfect and what have you, once she let herself feel the helplessness from decades before, then that behavior of control, over control, was dissipated. But I so thank you for showing the part two. In my mind, the film, and I do just want to make the point of, I know the audio and the words didn't exactly match up. That's because we're on Zoom and that there's a delay with the visual. The actual film, when you get that, do match up. So I just wanted to make that point. But Kathy, I'm so glad you chose to show the part two. In my mind, it's those part two film clips, and we have like 9 different ones. One is one of our ambassadors whose parent and brother both were murdered, and with the work that she did to forgive the murderers. We have a chaplain. He talks about having a traumatic church injury, as he calls it, an administrative type of injury, and the forgiveness that he had to do. We have a film clip about veterans. We have a film clip about someone who was in a blended family and didn't have a sense of belonging, that type of soul injury. We have someone who had been in the foster care system, and we had someone who, we have a film clip of a nurse practitioner who made a mistake that had a serious impact on a patient, and she couldn't forgive herself for not being perfect, so to speak. So a lot of different, because, you know, these concepts that we're talking about are only really good, so to speak, if they're put into practice. And when you hear how people have put them into practice and you hear from them, you could see on Sandra's face, even just as she told it, she went from pain to relief. And so that's the power of forgiveness. And I think that's the power of the film, really, is the part two and the actual application, where you hear people saying, okay, I took this concept and this is what I did with it, and this is what happened.
Thank you, Deborah. We are drawing close on time here, so I am going to thank Ralph, Deborah, and Stephanie for sharing today. Your insights, the clips you shared were wonderful and gave us great insight into the process of forgiveness and what even that can look like. I also now I'm going to turn it over to Angie, who's going to read some questions and see if we can answer those. And then she's going to do a wrap up with the pre-order for this forgiveness film at a discounted rate. So I will turn over to Angie at this point.
Thanks, Kathy. So yeah, we will be offering a pre-sale for the film, and I'll be sending that out to everyone who's attended today via email, but it will be on pre-sale until August 8th for a discounted price of $34.95. So we will stay on a little longer than the top of the hour to answer as many questions as we can. I know people will have to drop off, but we'll try to address as many as we can. So the first question that I have in the chat is, how do you forgive when a person continues to hurt you over and over and never apologizes?
Well, I don't see my 2 cohorts saying anything. So, all right. First of all, I want to say that it is much, much, much harder to forgive someone who's still doing the behavior, the betrayal, the what have you. That's a very different situation than if it's in the past, so to speak. The other thing, in these types of situations, I think we have to be very careful as friends, as relatives, as clinicians, to not tell people, oh, you need to forgive him. Oh, you should forgive. Oh, you know, you're staying stuck because you haven't forgiven. We should never be saying something like that to someone, because forgiveness is a personal decision and it is personal work. There is a rhythm to it. And when you have someone that is still in the midst of say an assault that happens or what have you, you want to be careful about the timing of forgiveness. So I do want to say that, because you're going to see this film and you're going to think that we have one of the small film clips in part 2 that says, when should you not forgive? And you should not forgive until you are ready. And we don't talk enough about being ready. It takes work to get ready to forgive. You can go through all the steps that we give you on the film. We give you kind of a recipe for what to do. But if you don't really want to forgive, then it's all going to be a sham. It's all going to be a facade. So to answer that question, I would say, you always want to be open to the grace of forgiveness, open to the possibility that forgiveness can come, but it might not ever come. And we should not make people feel guilty if they choose not to forgive. That is their decision. And how arrogant it is of us to tell someone that they should forgive. They need to forgive. I think that's an example of iatrogenic trauma that adds another layer on people who are already hurting. So yes, we need to create a safe environment where they can consider the possibility, but we need to be careful about how we phrase that and how we do that, so that we don't add another layer of guilt on top of it, because then they start thinking, what's wrong with me that I'm not a big enough person to be able to forgive? It seems like everybody else can. Why can't I? Well, they're not suffering the hurt. So.
Well, my answer was going to be that it doesn't sound like a forgiveness issue. It sounds like a setting the boundaries issue, where the person has to be able to stand up for themselves. And I don't know if I can get in the screen, the little symbol that we use about, the openness, and you're willing to accept from people, but then you put up the barrier and stop them against things that, hurt you. Yeah. Stephanie's doing it right. And Stephanie does a great job, but to me, it sounds like it's a setting boundaries. And then once the boundaries are set and the person realizes what they're doing is wrong, isn't it? And then maybe can move into the forgiveness issue. But as long as it's.
I would like
ahead.
to add one thing to all of that, and that is we have to be genuinely ready and authentic to get to that place of forgiveness. It can't be, oh, I forgive them, I forgive that, and go on, because then that you're not at a true place to. So like Deborah just expressed, you have to be ready to forgive, and that comes with authenticity, and you will recognize it. Because if you're just like, oh, I forgive it, oh yeah, that's, or asking somebody else to do it, they're not there. And to be able to place that you can be open to forgive, but have boundaries to protect you, you will recognize when you're in that genuine place, and you shouldn't do it until you're there.
I think for those of us who are clinicians, we need to recognize our own personal assumptions that we make and that we bring into the dynamic. I know for myself, for many years, I have a couple, first of all, I've facilitated forgiveness on people's deathbeds many times. I see the liberation that happens. My own personal religious convictions is that, we need to forgive. And what have you. And so I had very much a personal bias to push people to forgive, rather than creating an open environment where forgiveness could be possible and leading them on a road that they could choose or not choose to do that. That's that personal decision. So I think that's another important ingredient that we haven't really talked about, and that is recognizing our own bias for trying to either push forgiveness, or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe we bring our own baggage and say, oh, you should never forgive something like that. So at any rate, as I said, we have a film clip of someone who actually was able to forgive people, two young boys that murdered her mother and her brother. And, I don't know if I could ever do that. Honestly, I don't know if I have the courage or the strength to do something like that, to tell you the truth. That doesn't mean that I shouldn't, but I may not be able to do that authentically. And I really wouldn't want someone trying to push that on me and telling me that I have to do that if I'm going to have peace. That's as you said, Stephanie, that has to be something that's authentic.
I'm going to just give 2 more questions. The next one is, how important is it that we share our forgiveness directly with the person being forgiven?
Well, I will say for me, I have definitely a situation in my family that that person never asked for forgiveness. They had continued, they'd hurt me several times throughout my life. And to them, that's just the way it is. That's who they are. And I needed to get over it. But what I had to do was forgive them, for they know not what they do. And that comes from my biblical background and faith of saying they are never going to get to a place to want forgiveness because they didn't do anything wrong. But they continually hurt me over and over again. So when I got to a place, as we talked before, about discerning what was my part, what was their part, and making my percentage of what am I responsible for, I actually got to a genuine place that I could forgive them for their peace. And yet I found a boundary to protect myself, and I know how and when to let them in. And I know that's something that we haven't really talked about, that Ralph touched on, but that's been very important for me. And I will tell you, it is freedom that I have received from being able to forgive them when they didn't even ask me for it. And I can move forward and I can actually like them. I can somewhat hang out with them and not feel resentment and anger and be frustrated with them because I have my boundary. And yet I know I will accept while I've already forgiven them, for they know not what they do.
The other thing I was just going to say is I really like what Dewana just typed in, which is, and we didn't make this point, so Dewana, thank you for making the point, is that forgiveness is really for us. We do that to free ourselves. It's not for the other person. And I do think you have to be careful about going to someone else and saying, oh, I forgive you for what you did. Because that could just make them defensive. It can sometimes make things worse. So if they're coming to you asking for forgiveness, that's one thing. But to go to someone else and say, oh, I forgive you when you did such and such, and they're going to a lot of times just get defensive. So Dewana's point, forgiveness frees us.
Absolutely.
It's for us, not the other person. That's a bonus if that happens.
All right, the last question we're going to do is, where does one begin in forgiving oneself?
I would say by realizing that you're not perfect.
That's right.
And you make mistakes. A lot of times people feel guilty about decisions they've made or things that they've done because they have this vision of themselves that they're a perfect person, and they've let themselves down by doing something that's imperfect. So I think it's just really important for people to realize they're not perfect. Nobody is.
I think you also have to be ready to muster the courage to go down roads you've never gone before, to be able to say, I am ready to sit in the pain of my emotions of what this caused or how I feel, and then know that it's not going to be forever. Maybe it's for a moment, but know that it's going to take courage and you're ready for that journey, knowing it's not going to be easy, but yet there may be freedom for you at the end as you take that long journey, because it's not a light switch moment. But when you start walking through that journey and then turn around and look at yourself a year ago, 5 years ago, at the steps that you've taken in the process of healing you've done, you begin to see that it's worth the continued travel.
Well, thank you everyone for your time today. Thank you to Ralph, Deborah, and Stephanie for agreeing to be part of this live chat, and a special thank you to Kathy Metcalf for moderating for us today.
Yes,
I will
thank
be sending out a follow-up email. We have a lot of exciting things going on at Opus Peace, including a sexual violence workshop in September, our institute, which we've mentioned several times, in October, and the release of the forgiveness film. So I will send all of that information out via email to everyone that's attended. Again, thank you so much for being a part of our live chat today. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye, everybody.
you.
Bye.